Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. Muslims recite the Quran daily. We seek to understand it and apply it in our lives, and yet there are some verses that are often misunderstood, and they deserve re-examining. I'm here with Dr. Shabir Ally. Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Let's continue our series, Dr. Shabir, on misunderstood Quranic verses. The verse we're looking at today is from chapter 4, verse 128, and it reads like this. And if a woman fears that her husband is unfaithful to her or shunning her, there would be no sin on them if they were to privately reach an amicable settlement.
Yeah, it's an interesting verse. This verse is a follow-up discussion from a verse that we discussed previously on this show, Surah 4, verse 34. Now, the verses are separated by more than 100 verses or close to 100 verses in between. So one does not readily see the connection. And scholars have tended to interpret this latter verse in isolation without reference to the previous one. Mm-hmm. But only with reference to the previous one can we see how they fit together and how it all makes sense. But the way they made sense of it in isolation is to say that this verse means that if a woman fears that her husband is going to treat her in a high-handed manner, or he might be turning away from her, he doesn't desire her anymore, maybe he wants to get married to a second wife, then in that case, there is no harm if the two of them should reach an amicable settlement. In describing what they feel like the commentators think to be an amicable settlement, like possibilities include that the woman may give back part or all of the dowry that was given to her in the first place, mm-hmm. And she remains a wife, or she might just simply settle for being a sort of a token wife. She's there as a wife. She's just like hanging on there by a string. The one last thing that remains is for her husband to say, I divorce you, and then she's gone. Or she just hangs on there. She's not divorced, but she's not much of a wife anyway. And they describe also a situation where the man may want to marry a second or third or fourth wife. And this wife in question, who is not so desirable to the husband anymore, may say, you know what, instead of allotting me a turn in the rotation when you visit your wives, I'll give up my turn, so you don't have to include me. Mm-hmm. So one looking at this today must find that this is, although some women may find that this is advantageous or this is the best that they can hope for in the present circumstance. To have this as a general rule that this could often happen, you can see the situation where many women will be unfairly treated in society, and naturally this cannot be the beauty that God wants to see among His creatures. So we need to interpret this verse and understand it in a better way. And to me, the proper interpretation comes about when we see that this verse is actually connected to Surah 4, verse 34.
Mm-hmm. So this which we spoke about last time, right?
So they're in the same surah. And Raymond Farrin had, in his book on structure and meaning in the Quran, had pointed out that the Quran is arranged in such a way that the first part is reflected in the last part. And not only the Quran as a whole, but surahs within the Quran are also arranged that way. So if we think of Surah 4, verse 34, and we think of Surah 4, verse 128, so 34 has 33 verses before it. And if we think of 128, and the whole chapter has 176 verses, then another maybe 50 or so verses, and we get to the end of the chapter. And we can see that these two verses, in a way, mirror each other if we were to fold the chapter into half. So one half reflecting on the other one. We see another instance of this, by the way, in the same surah where verses number 11 and 12 speak about the details of inheritance. And then the very last verse number 176, also gives you rules about inheritance, as if it's a follow-up from the discussion of inheritance in the early part of the chapter. Here, we fold the chapter in two halves, and we see that one half is mirrored in the other. More to the point, verse number 100 128, which we're dealing with now, follows from 127, which says that they're seeking a fatwa or a verdict from you. God is now going to give you the verdict, in addition to what was mentioned earlier, which is an obvious reference to what was mentioned earlier in the same chapter regarding marrying women and treating the orphans, taking care of the orphans, and so on, verses which we've already looked at previously. And now coming back to the verse itself, 128, it says, وَإِنْ إِمْرَأَةٌ خَافَتْ مِنْ بَعْلِهَا نُشُوزًا أَوْ إِعْرَاضًا. If a woman fears nushuz, I'll keep the word untranslated for the moment, أو إعراضًا, which means turning away. So if a woman fears nushuz, or turning away on the part of her husband, then there is no harm if the two of them, there's no sin on the two of them if they should reach a private settlement. The word nushuz almost sounds like new shoes, so you can easily remember that word. Nushuz, if we look at the etymology, it means something like rising up. And it's used like this in the Quran, in the 50th chapter of the Quran. If you're told in a gathering, rise up, then you should rise up. But that's, of course, in a good way. It has a good meaning, rising up, getting up to make space for other people to sit down, and so on. But it can also have a negative meaning, especially when we're dealing with the law of God, rising up against the law of God. Now, in Surah 4, verse 34, the same word nushuz was used, and the same idea, if you fear. Like those whose nushuz you fear, those whose rising up you fear. But it's not rising up against, like a wife not rising up against her husband, which is how the classical interpreters interpreted it. It is, in that case, a woman rising up against the command of God to keep oneself chaste. Because it says, فَصَالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٍ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. The righteous women are devout to God, and they guard that which God would have them guard in private. So it's obviously referring to sexual chastity. So the same word is being used, and the same idea of being in fear that some impropriety is being committed is obviously referring to infidelity in Surah 4, verse 128 as well. So now it's the flip side. If the woman were to fear that her husband is getting into something unseemly, then there is no harm if they were to settle the matter privately among themselves. So that means they could talk it over, and she could caution him and say, look, we can keep this private among ourselves. It doesn't have to go to the qadi, to the judge, because if it goes to the judge, then the judge may apply corporal punishment on the husband. And the reverse is also true, as we saw in Surah 4, verse 34 earlier. When the matter is brought to the judge may apply corporal punishment against the wife. So too with verse 128, corporal punishment may be applied, but they could settle the matter privately, and she could watch his behavior and see, does he reform, or does it really get out of hand, and later on she might have to report him to the authorities and get her matter resolved for her own future out of a marriage like this.
So Dr. Shabir, why do you think this interpretation is better then?
Well, this is better because it's very balanced. God is fair, and there is no reason why God would give a lopsided set of commandments that would favor men and be unfavorable to women. So it's even. What applies to women applies to men as well, unless there is some mitigating circumstance. Like, for example, Surah 4, verse 115, in the same broader context, speaks about women being placed under house arrest. And the same thing seems to be mirrored in Surah 4, verse 34. There is that stage of quarantining them. But that may not have applied to men in that traditional society, because traditionally men were the breadwinners, and if they were quarantined, then perhaps the whole family will suffer from a lack of income. So the other measures might have been applied against the men. Unless there was some mitigating circumstance or some mitigating factor, we can say that the laws of God, when they're given in the Quran, are, equally for men and women, and they apply fairly across the board.
All right. Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Media Hub, the new home of Let the Quran Speak.
Here we spread positivity and good. We help people experience the beauty of Islam and help them appreciate and understand Muslims.
This beautiful building we purchased at cost $2.3 million.
Yeah, we've already raised a third of that money, and with your help, inshallah, we can pay off the rest.
So we're looking for people who can give $1,000 each. If you can be part of the select group, that's amazing.
Otherwise, just please give whatever you can. Every dollar counts.
It's our collective responsibility to share the message of Islam with our fellow human beings. Please help us continue this good work.
It's a sadaqah jariyah, something that will continue to be a benefit to the Muslim community long after Safiya and I are gone.
Please support our work at muslimmediahub.com.
Your support is zakat eligible and tax deductible.
May Allah bless you and your loved ones today and always. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.